thank you once again for coming along to Eco Views and News. Today we're here in sympathy and solidarity with the people of Japan. The whole island is experiencing the 1-year anniversary of the Fukushima Daiichi tragedy and the earthquake and the tsunami that triggered it. So we're going to look back a little bit at these issues and see if we as a human community have learned anything, in a sense, by what's gone on, because we're in trouble if we haven't. We have got very few chances. In fact, this has been referred to as our second Chernobyl, and for that reason it's good to keep in mind what might be learned from something like this. And for those who've gone through it, they're in the process of trying to piece together lives. A full year afterwards, 3,000 people are still missing and not going to be found. In any case, that's the problem we're up against in some sense. The question is one of closure, and we're searching for meaning in the face of tragedy on a global scale. We want to look at what happened and is being reported in Japan itself today. Japan was going to mark the quake and tsunami anniversary with a series of services and public ceremonies that were headed by the country's highest political and civil leaders. They came from all over, and Al Jazeera reported on it. We get a sense of the flavor from it. Let's see what we can pull up from their reporting on it. I think it's really quite staggering when you look at the scale of the tragedy and the nature of the response to it now that we've had a year to look at it. Take a look.
Japan, people have been told to stop even working on messaging on their social networks for devastating, to pause and remember.
Now, the ceremonies were headed by the emperor himself. The emperor has just had bypass surgery and is just out of the hospital in the last few weeks. In fact, he wasn't clear that it was going to be possible for him to attend, but he did manage to attend, and they focused the sentiment of the entire country. The BBC reported on it, and it's perhaps worth listening to their account of it. He made a very moving statement as Emperor of the Japanese people.
It
has been 1 year since the Great Eastern Japan earthquake. We are all gathered together in deep mourning to offer condolences to the deceased. A year ago today, there was an unprecedented earthquake and ensuing tsunami, with many lives lost and many missing.
その中には消防団員をはじめ危険を顧み
Within those who
ず
have perished,
人々
there
の
were
救助や
volunteers
防災活動
and
に
disaster
従事
prevention
して
staff such as
命を落とした
fire brigade
多くの
personnel,
人々が
and we
生
shall
まれてい
never
ること
forget
を
those who offered
忘れ
their
ることが
lives
でき
in
ません。
such rescue missions.
さらにこの震災のため
Furthermore, because of this disaster, there was a nuclear
危険な区域に住む
disaster.
人々は住み慣れた
Some of the people
そして
who have been living in the evacuation zone had been
離れざるを
forced
得なくなり
away from their beloved
再びそ
homes.
こに安全に住むためには
In order to live in that area safely, we are faced with the difficulties in having to resolve the contamination by
こ
radiation.
の度の大震災にあたっては国や
Through the disasters, we have had many volunteer staff who went to the disaster-stricken areas to help in the recovery.
このような活動は厳しい避難生活の中で
And these activities bring warmth to the people who are forced to live under difficult conditions in the disaster-stricken areas.
被災者
And all
や
those people who have worked for the victims and for the disaster-stricken areas, I would like to offer deep gratitude for the assiduity that these people have shown.
Okay, a very moving talk which covered both the tragedy of the tsunami itself and those who then came to the assistance of those and were killed, and beyond that those who then worked in the nuclear contaminated areas. Well, as it turns out, there's a great deal of discussion in Japan, as you might expect, about some of these issues, because a recent report made it clear that some of the reaction to especially the nuclear disaster could have been better. In fact, the headlines read, "Nuclear disaster in Japan was avoidable," critics contend. Well, this is very sobering news, and it's part of the effort then to try to find meaning in the search of this tragedy is figuring out how we should respond to this whole question of dependence in Japan upon the nuclear. How can we make sense of nature and the human tragedy here, nature being the earthquake and tsunami that came after it? What meaning does it have for the Japanese? Well, this depends largely upon what the Japanese think nature is itself.
Japanese view of nature.
Everything seems to evoke this sense of awe. So it could be an amazing, sort of torrent or a big rock or an interesting pine tree. They all seem to evoke this imagination that it is not just a tree, but there is a spirit living in it. And that goes back a long way, in the Japanese history and tradition and culture, that people have always had this very strong, almost empathy or relationship with nature. Maybe this is where Buddhism comes in, that people accept that life is transient. Things never stay the same, especially if you're living in an environment that is constantly shaken. You would realize from the core that life can be transient. On the other hand, I think there is also a sense of gratitude for being alive. Although they did suffer terribly, many of them expressed this deep sense of gratitude they have towards life.
Now that sense of gratitude is expressed as a sense of moral obligation as well. Out of the tragedy, that all experienced in Japan, and we've globally now experienced when we see it. There is a tragedy that's delivered, as it were, from nature, but there's a deep sense of gratitude toward life, having been spared death in Japan among those who are still living and reflecting on things. And that sense of gratitude is really quite important to think about, because it is motivating a lot of what's going on now within Japan and the thinking of people. And with some, there is a moral conclusion or a message to be drawn from these events, answering the larger question, how should those of us who survived now behave? It's interesting to
Gratitude towards life is hard to sustain in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Religious leaders and their followers have struggled to find a sense of positive purpose in the earthquake and tsunami. Professor Susumu Shimazono of the University of Tokyo sees this as a search for meaning, perhaps even the search for a message.
Something beyond us, telling us something very important. This is, I think, very common. Many people are feeling that we must change our way of life because something was wrong. We were too proud. It is not easy to change the whole society, but people can do their own things as a human being, as an individual. So many people, I think, felt that they should change their own life. It is, of course, related to the nuclear power and the electricity, using the energy as if it is unlimited, and the economic growth will have no end. This kind of optimistic idea we enjoyed these last maybe 50, 60 years, but many people are feeling that it has ended.
Even religions without a belief in a creator God have encouraged this kind of reappraisal. Shinto and Buddhist thought has turned, in Professor Shimazono's observation, to identifying lessons from the tragedy.
We don't feel that one divine, will is causing this disaster. One God is punishing us. This is very different from our concept of the world. Great nature may do something very unhappy for us, very unexpected, but something may be wrong. So the great nature is responding to it in a very unexpected way, like coughing, sneezing.
If the interpretation of the disaster is that great nature was responding to something wrong, as if the earthquake were an ecological fit of coughing or sneezing, then it would seem wise for people to heed the lesson in order to prevent it happening again.
Well, that's a very interesting formulation of things. The idea that great nature, the concept of great nature is, in effect, coughing or sneezing. What should we learn from that? And what should we do by way of our own behavior? Well, this gentleman feels that it should make us think about our own behavior in an ecosystem where we're doing some very, very dangerous things. And whether we can learn that further afield, like here in America, from the Fukushima Daiichi tragedy, is not clear. We too need to rethink our dependence on nuclear, and some have started to do that at this point. You can see it now on shows like Tom Hartman's show, where he's posed the question with the group called Beyond Nuclear. Take a look.
In the best of the rest of the news, in a little over a week, we'll hit the one-year anniversary of the earthquake and tsunami that triggered a nuclear crisis at Fukushima in Japan. And this week we're learning that that nuclear crisis was even worse than was originally thought. On Wednesday, Japanese scientists announced that twice as much radioactive cesium than estimated blew out of the plant after the earthquake and tsunami. That's about 40,000 trillion becquerels. And it took just 18 days for those radioactive particles to encircle the planet, turning up in places as far away as Vermont. French scientists are now calling on Japan to remain vigilant in its inspections of fruit, milk, and game to prevent further radioactive contamination. These new numbers come on the heels of a Greenpeace report on the Fukushima disaster, in which that organization places the blame for the crisis not on the natural disaster, but instead on the Japanese government. The report accuses the Japanese government of ignoring the risks posed to Fukushima before the earthquake and, quote, cutting corners to protect profits over people, end quote. It goes on to argue that nuclear energy is inherently unsafe and governments are too quick to approve nuclear power plants, while at the same time unable to deal with the consequences of nuclear disasters. That includes the United States. Currently, there are 23 General Electric Mark I reactors in operation around the United States. Mark I is the same reactor design used at Fukushima. And just last month, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued a warning to 96 nuclear reactors around the nation that sit on fault lines, urging operators to perform new stress tests to see if the reactor can hold up in an earthquake. So what should we make of all this? Kevin Camps joins me now. He's the radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear, beyondnuclear.org. Kevin, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you with us.
Okay, you can see they're going to reflect a bit on what we should be learning from the use of nuclear in the wake of this Fukushima Daiichi meltdown. It's really very sobering, especially since our plants are designed on the same model as that which had such tragedy in Japan.
What do you make about this new information coming to light about Fukushima? Just how bad could it have gotten, or might it still get?
Incredible revelations are coming out on a daily basis at this point. So, for example, the New York Times on Monday night reported that a private investigation, 30 investigators brought together by a former editor of the Asahi Shimbun in Japan, which is a major newspaper, incredible revelations. So Edano, who was the chief cabinet secretary, the main spokesman at the time that the nuclear catastrophe began, was saying things like, no immediate health threat, the radiation's blowing out to sea, don't worry about it. If you're within 20 kilometers, yes, it may affect you. If you're not, it won't affect you. Incredibly, what the New York Times revealed is that Edano admitted to this investigatory group that the worst case scenario that he and the Prime Minister knew about was what he called a demonic chain reaction of meltdowns. So we had Fukushima Daiichi, 3 meltdowns. They knew about that. It was happening. But Fukushima Daini, 4 more reactors just 7 miles to the south. They were worried the radioactivity releases from Daiichi would cause an evacuation of the workers from Daini. Those 4 reactors would melt down. And then further south, closer to Tokyo, there's another reactor. And so they were looking at the worst case scenario, all those reactors melting down, releasing catastrophic amounts of radioactivity, and long story short, evacuating Tokyo, a city of more than 30 million people, and abandoning it forever. The way that Edano put it was losing Tokyo. If we lost Daiichi, Daini, and Tokai, we would lose Tokyo.
That's incredible. Just what does 40,000 trillion becquerels mean?
Well, 70% went into the ocean.
Well, first of all, what does that number mean?
Well, a becquerel is a single radioactive disintegration.
Okay, so compare that to somebody getting an X-ray, somebody getting too much radiation, what people were exposed to around Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I mean, how does the average person understand what this number means?
It's a catastrophic radioactivity release. The powers that be in the nuclear establishment would like people to think that it simply dilutes into the Earth's atmosphere, into the Earth's oceans. We know that any exposure to radioactivity carries a health risk, and so that means that that dilution gets reversed in nature. It moves its way up the food chain.
It gets concentrated.
Bioconcentration, biomagnification. And so the food pathway is where people are going to be the most exposed to internal radiation doses, which conveniently the nuclear industry often neglects to the point of just ignoring completely. That is a very serious pathway of health damage.
And that's the stuff that can cause cancer. It's inside your body. It's just
a whole spectrum of diseases. They also like to focus just on cancer. That happens all the time. But if you look at Chernobyl, for example, a whole spectrum of diseases, including genetic damage, certainly a vast number of different kinds of cancers, but things like Chernobyl heart, which is radioactive cesium attacking the heart muscle in children, thyroid pathology, And the list just keeps going.
Now, one of the things that they said is that twice as much radioactive cesium was released as they had previously disclosed. And previously they had said, oh, well, there's twice as much as we had said before.
Yeah.
This is the second doubling. Why should anybody care about radioactive cesium? How does that enter the food chain? What does it do in the food chain? How does it affect humans?
It's actually the third doubling, and each time you've had me on the show, and it was weeks into this catastrophe, they doubled it. Months in, they doubled it, and now here we are a year later, they're doubling it again. So it's just incredible. I mentioned Chernobyl heart. It is radioactive cesium, which seeks human muscle tissue. That's where it ends up.
So the body thinks that cesium is potassium, is that right?
Yes, your body mistakes this. It ends up in places like the heart, and the children in the Chernobyl region have heart pathologies that you would expect to see in very old people, but these are children. Groups like the Irish Chernobyl Children's Project have organized teams of doctors from Western Europe, the United States, to go into Belarus where they lack this kind of specialization in medicine and do just like a MASH unit, hundreds and hundreds of heart surgeries on children to put patches on their hearts because they have holes in their hearts. And it's the radioactive cesium. And actually the doctor, Dr. Bandashevsky in Belarus, who figured out what was going on, was imprisoned by the dictatorship of Belarus to try to shut them up. Because
you don't want that kind of information getting out. Now, Tom Hartman comes to a conclusion that's pretty interesting about this after reflecting upon the Vermont nuclear situation. But he gives a little essay at the end.
Kevin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And for the great work you're doing at beyondnuclear.org. The clock to nuclear disaster here in the United States is ticking. Let's ditch nuclear power, the most expensive and most dangerous form of energy on the planet, before we regret what might happen.
Okay, well, that's Tom Hartman's take on it, and it's interesting to see that the mainstream media basically hasn't started commenting on this to this extent. We're searching for meaning in the face of this tragedy, but one of the meanings might be, if we took it from the Japanese, that great nature is giving us a signal here that we ought to pay attention to. And are we listening to that? It's not clear we are, and maybe don't have the capacity to in the Western world. We don't even speak Japanese, don't hear what they're saying to each other, and we haven't been paying a lot of attention, I'm afraid, to the street demonstrations against the government and against the future of nuclear usage in that country. Keep in touch online or on air, and we'll be treating these issues. Thank you very much.